On her first return to the castle, she had felt an aversion towards the offspring of another, and therefore abandoned them entirely to the attendants appointed by Swanhilda. Now, however, she began to pay considerable attention to them, and caused them to be frequently admitted into her presence. The aged nurses were filled with dread at perceiving these marks of regard from her towards their young charges, yet dared they not to oppose the will of their terrible and imperious mistress. Soon did Brunhilde gain the affection of the children, who were too unsuspecting of guile to apprehend any danger from her. On the contrary, her caresses won them completely to her. Instead of ever checking their mirthful gambols, she would rather instruct them in new sports. Often, too, did she recite to them tales of such strange and wild interest as to exceed all the stories of their nurses. Were they wearied either with play or with listening to her narratives, she would take them on her knees and lull them to slumber. Then did visions of the most surpassing magnificence attend their dreams. They would fancy themselves in some garden where flowers of every hue rose in rows above one the other, from the humble violet to the tall sunflower, forming a party-colored broidery of every hue, sloping upwards towards the golden clouds, where little angels, whose wings sparkled with azure and gold, descended to bring them delicious cakes or splendid jewels, or sung to them soothing melodious hymns. So delightful did these dreams in short time become to the children that they longed for nothing so eagerly as to slumber on Brunhilde's lap, for never did they else enjoy such visions of heavenly forms. Thus were they most anxious for that which was to prove their destruction. Yet do we not all aspire after that which conducts us to the grave, after the enjoyment of life? These incidents stretched out their arms to approaching death, because it assumed the mask of pleasure. For, while they were lapped in these ecstatic slumbers, Brunhilde sucked the life-stream from their bosoms. On waking, indeed, they felt themselves faint and exhausted, yet did no pain nor any mark betray the cause. Shortly, however, did their strength entirely fail, even as the summer brook is gradually dried up. Their sports became less and less noisy. Their loud, frolicsome laughter was converted into a faint smile. The full tones of their voices died away into a mere whisper. Their attendants were filled with horror and despair. Too well did they conjecture the horrible truth, yet dared not to impart their suspicions to Walter, who was so devotedly attached to his horrible partner. Death had already smote his prey. The children were but the mere shadows of their former selves, and even this shadow quickly disappeared. The anguished father deeply bemoaned their loss, for Notwithstanding his apparent neglect, he was strongly attached to them, nor until he had experienced their loss was he aware that his love was so great. His affliction could not fail to excite the displeasure of Brunhilde. "Why dost thou lament so fondly," said she, "for these little ones? What satisfaction could such unformed beings yield to thee unless thou wert still attached to their mother? Thy heart, then, is still hers? Or dost thou now regret her and them because thou art satiated with my fondness and weary of my endearments? Had these young ones grown up, would they not have attached thee, thy spirit, and thy affections more closely to this earth of clay, to this dust, and have alienated thee from that sphere to which I, who have already passed the grave, endeavor to raise thee? Say, is thy spirit so heavy, or thy love so weak, or thy faith so hollow, that the hope of being mine forever is unable to touch thee?" Thus did Brunhilde express her indignation at her consort's grief, and forbade him her presence. The fear of offending her beyond forgiveness, and his anxiety to appease her, soon dried up his tears, and he again abandoned himself to his fatal passion, until approaching destruction at length awakened him from his delusion. Neither maiden nor youth was any longer to be seen, either within the dreary walls of the castle or the adjoining territory. All had disappeared, for those whom the grave had not swallowed up had fled from the region of death. Who, therefore, now remained to quench the horrible thirst of the female vampire, save Walter himself? And his death she dared to contemplate unmoved, for that divine sentiment that unites two beings in one joy and one sorrow was unknown to her bosom. Was he in his tomb? So was she free to search out other victims, and glut herself with destruction, until she herself should, at the last day, be consumed with the earth itself. Such is the fatal law to which the dead are subject, when awoke by the arts of necromancy from the sleep of the grave. She now began to fix her bloodthirsty lips on Walter's breast, when cast into a profound sleep by the odor of her violet breath. He reclined beside her, quite unconscious of his impending fate. Yet soon did his vital powers begin to decay, and many a gray hair peeped through his raven locks. With his strength, his passion also declined, and he now frequently left her in order to pass the whole day in the sports of the chase, hoping thereby to regain his wonted vigor. As he was reposing one day in a wood beneath the shade of an oak, he perceived on the summit of a tree a bird of strange appearance and quite unknown to him, but before he could take aim at it with his bow, it flew away into the clouds, at the same time letting fall a rose-colored root, which dropped at Walter's feet, who immediately took it up, and, although he was well acquainted with almost every plant, he could not remember to have seen any at all resembling this. Its delightfully odoriferous scent induced him to try its flavor, but 10 times more bitter than wormwood, it was even as gall in his mouth, upon which, impatient of the disappointment, he flung it away with violence. Had he, however, been aware of its miraculous quality, and that it acted as a countercharm against the opiate perfume of Brunhilde's breath, he would have blessed it in spite of its bitterness. Thus do mortals often blindly cast away in displeasure the unsavory remedy that would otherwise work their weal. When Walter returned home in the evening, and laid him down to repose as usual by Brunhilde's side, the magic power of her breath produced no effect upon him, and for the first time during many months did he close his eyes in a natural slumber. Yet hardly had he fallen asleep ere a pungent, smarting pain disturbed him from his dreams, and, opening his eyes, he discerned by the gloomy rays of a lamp that glimmered in the apartment what for some moments transfixed him quite aghast, for it was Brunhilde drawing with her lips the warm blood from his bosom. The wild cry of horror which at length escaped him terrified Brunhilde, whose mouth was besmeared with the warm blood. "Monster!" exclaimed he, springing from the couch. "Is it thus that you love me?" "Ay, even as the dead love," replied she, with a malignant coldness. "Creature of blood," continued Walter, "the delusion which has so long blinded me is at an end. Thou art the fiend who hast destroyed my children, who hast murdered the offspring of my vassals." Raising herself upwards, and at the same time casting on him a glance that froze him to the spot with dread, she replied, "It is not I who have murdered them. I was obliged to pamper myself with warm, youthful blood, in order that I might satisfy thy curious desires. Thou art the murderer." These dreadful words summoned before Walter's terrified conscience the threatening shades of all those who had thus perished, while despair choked his voice. "Why," continued she, in a tone that increased his horror, "why dost thou make mouths at me like a puppet? Thou who hadst the courage to love the dead, to take into thy bed one who had been sleeping in the grave, the bedfellow of the worm, who hast clasped in thy lustful arms the corruption of the tomb, dost thou, unhallowed as thou art, now raise this hideous cry for the sacrifice of a few lives? They are but leaves swept from their branches by a storm. Come, chase these idiot fancies, and taste the bliss thou hast so dearly purchased." So saying, she extended her arms towards him, but this motion served only to increase his terror, and exclaiming, "Accursed being!" he rushed out of the apartment. All the horrors of a guilty, upbraiding conscience became his companions now that he was awakened from the delirium of his unholy pleasures. Frequently did he curse his own obstinate blindness for having given no heed to the hints and admonitions of his children's nurses, but treating them as vile calumnies. But his sorrow was now too late. For although repentance may gain pardon for the sinner, it cannot alter the immutable decrees of fate. It cannot recall the murdered from the tomb. No sooner did the first break of dawn appear than he set out for his lonely castle in the mountains, determined no longer to abide under the same roof with so terrific a being, yet vain was his flight. For on waking the following morning he perceived himself in Brunhilde's arms, and quite entangled in her long raven tresses, which seemed to involve him and bind him in the fetters of his fate. The powerful fascination of her breath held him still more captivated, so that, forgetting all that had passed, he returned her caresses, until, awakening as if from a dream, he recoiled in unmixed horror from her embrace. During the day he wandered through the solitary wilds of the mountains, as a culprit seeking an asylum from his pursuers, and at night retired to the shelter of a cave, fearing less to couch himself within such a dreary place than to expose himself to the horror of again meeting Brunhilde. But alas! it was in vain that he endeavored to flee her. Again, when he awoke, he found her the partner of his miserable bed. Nay, had he sought the centre of the earth as his hiding place, had he even embedded himself beneath rocks, or formed his chamber in the recesses of the ocean, still had he found her his constant companion, for by calling her again into existence, he had rendered himself inseparably hers. So fatal were the links that united them. Struggling with the madness that was beginning to seize him, brooding incessantly on the ghastly visions that presented themselves to his horror-stricken mind, he lay motionless in the gloomiest recesses of the woods, even from the rise of sun till the shades of eve. But no sooner was the light of day extinguished in the west, and the woods buried in impenetrable darkness, than the apprehension of resigning himself to sleep drove him forth among the mountains. The storm played wildly with the fantastic clouds and with the rattling leaves, as they were caught up into the air, as if some dread spirit was sporting with these images of transitoriness and decay. It roared among the summits of the oaks, as if uttering a voice of fury, while its hollow sound, rebounding among the distant hills, seemed as the moans of a departing sinner, or as the faint cry of some wretch expiring under the murderer's hand. The owl, too, uttered its ghastly cry, as if foreboding the wreck of nature. Walter's hair flew disorderly in the wind, like black snakes wreathing around his temples and shoulders, while each sense was awake to catch fresh horror. In the clouds he seemed to behold the forms of the murdered, in the howling wind to hear their laments and groans, in the chilling blast itself he felt the dire kiss of Brunhilde. In the cry of the screeching bird he heard her voice. In the mouldering leaves he scented the charnel bed out of which he had awakened her. "Murderer of thy own offspring!" exclaimed he, in a voice making night and the conflict of the elements still more hideous. "Paramour of a bloodthirsty vampire, reveller with the corruption of the tomb!" While in his despair he rent the wild locks from his head. Just then the full moon darted from beneath the bursting clouds, and the sight recalled to his remembrance the advice of the sorcerer, when he trembled at the first apparition of Brunhilde rising from her sleep of death, namely, to seek him at the season of the full moon in the mountains, where 3 roads met. Scarcely had this gleam of hope broke in on his bewildered mind than he flew to the appointed spot. On his arrival, Walter found the old man seated there upon a stone, as calmly as though it had been a bright sunny day, and completely regardless of the uproar around. "Art thou come yet?" exclaimed he to the breathless wretch, who, flinging himself at his feet, cried in a tone of anguish. "Oh, save me! Succor me! Rescue me from that monster that scattereth death and desolation around her! And wherefore a mysterious warning? Why didst thou not perceive how wholesome was the advice? Wake not the dead. And wherefore a mysterious warning? Why didst thou not rather disclose to me at once all the horrors that awaited my sacrilegious profanation of the grave? Wert thou able to listen to any other voice than that of thy impetuous passions? Did not thy eager impatience shut my mouth at the very moment I would have cautioned thee? True, true, thy reproof is just. But what does it avail now? I need the promptest aid. Well, replied the old man, there remains even yet a means of rescuing thyself, but it is fraught with horror and demands all thy resolution. Utter it, then, utter it, for what can be more appalling, more hideous than the misery I now endure? Know, then, continued the sorcerer, that only on the night of the new moon does she sleep the sleep of mortals, and then all the supernatural power which she inherits from the grave totally fails her. 'Tis then that thou must murder her. How murder her? Echoed Walter. Ay, returned the old man calmly. Pierce her bosom with a sharpened dagger, which I will furnish thee with. At the same time renounce her memory for ever, swearing never to think of her intentionally, and that if thou dost involuntarily, thou wilt repeat the curse. Most horrible yet! What can be more horrible than she herself is? I'll do it. Keep then this resolution until the next new moon. What, must I wait until then? Cried Walter. Alas, ere then, either her savage thirst for blood will have forced me into the night of the tomb, or horror will have driven me into the night of madness. Nay, replied the sorcerer, that I can prevent. And so saying, he conducted him to a cavern further among the mountains. Abide here twice 7 days, he said. So long can I protect thee against her deadly caresses. Here wilt thou find all due provision for thy wants, but take heed that nothing tempt thee to quit this place. Farewell. When the moon renews itself, then do I repair hither again. So saying, the sorcerer drew a magic circle around the cave and then immediately disappeared. Twice 7 days did Walter continue in this solitude, where his companions were his own terrifying thoughts and his bitter repentance. The present was all desolation and dread. The future presented the image of a horrible deed which he must perforce commit, while the past was poisoned by the memory of his guilt. Did he think on his former happy union with Brunhilde, her horrible image presented itself to his imagination with her lips defiled with dropping blood, or did he call to mind the peaceful days he had passed with Swanhilda? He beheld her sorrowful spirit with the shadows of her murdered children. Such were the horrors that attended him by day. Those of night were still more dreadful. For then he beheld Brunhilde herself, who, wandering around the magic circle, which she could not pass, called upon his name till the cavern re-echoed the horrible sound. "Walter, my beloved," cried she, Wherefore dost thou avoid me? Art thou not mine? Forever mine, mine here, and mine hereafter. And dost thou seek to murder me? Ah, commit not a deed which hurls us both to perdition, thyself as well as me. In this manner did the horrible visitant torment him each night, and even when she departed, robbed him of all repose. The night of the new moon at length arrived, dark as the deed it was doomed to bring forth. The sorcerer entered the cavern. "Come," said he to Walter, "let us depart hence. The hour is now arrived." And he forthwith conducted him in silence from the cave to a coal-black steed, the sight of which recalled to Walter's remembrance the fatal night. He then related to the old man Brunhilde's nocturnal visits, and anxiously inquired whether her apprehensions of eternal perdition would be fulfilled or not. "Mortal eye," exclaimed the sorcerer, "may not pierce the dark secrets of another world, or penetrate the deep abyss that separates earth from heaven." Walter hesitated to mount the steed. "Be resolute," exclaimed his companion. "But this once is it granted to thee to make the trial, and should thou fail now, naught can rescue thee from her power." "What could be more horrible than she herself? I am determined." And he leaped on the horse, the sorcerer mounting also behind him. Carried with a rapidity equal to that of the storm that sweeps across the plain, they in brief space arrived at Walter's castle. All the doors flew open at the bidding of his companion, and they speedily reached Brunhilde's chamber, and stood beside her couch. Reclining in a tranquil slumber, she reposed in all her native loveliness. Every trace of horror had disappeared from her countenance. She looked so pure, meek, and innocent that all the sweet hours of their endearments rushed to Walter's memory, like interceding angels pleading in her behalf. His unnerved hand could not take the dagger which the sorcerer presented to him. "The blow must be struck even now," said the latter. "Shouldst thou delay but an hour, she will lie at daybreak on thy bosom, sucking the warm life-drops from thy heart." "Horrible! Most horrible!" faltered the trembling Walter, and turning away his face, he thrust the dagger into her bosom, exclaiming, "I curse thee forever!" And the cold blood gushed upon his hand. Opening her eyes once more, she cast a look of ghastly horror on her husband, and in a hollow, dying accent said, "Thou too art doomed to perdition." "Lay now thy hand upon her corpse," said the sorcerer, "and swear the oath." Walter did as commanded, saying, "Never will I think of her with love, never recall her to mind intentionally, and should her image recur to my mind involuntarily, so will I exclaim to it, Be thou accursed." "Thou hast now done everything," returned the sorcerer. "Restore her, therefore, to the earth from which thou didst so foolishly recall her, and be sure to recollect thy oath, for shouldst thou forget it but once, she would return, and thou wouldst be inevitably lost. Adieu, we see each other no more." Having uttered these words, he quitted the apartment, and Walter also fled from the abode of horror, having first given direction that the corpse should be speedily interred. Again did the terrific Brunhilde repose within her grave, but her image continually haunted Walter's imagination, so that his existence was one continued martyrdom, in which he continually struggled to dismiss from his recollection the hideous phantoms of the past, yet the stronger his effort to banish them, so much the more frequently and the more vividly did they return, as the night wanderer who is enticed by a fire-wisp into quagmire or bog sinks the deeper into the damp grave the more he struggles to escape. His imagination seemed incapable of admitting any other image than that of Brunhilde. Now he fancied he beheld her expiring, the blood streaming from her beautiful bosom. At others he saw the lovely bride of his youth, who reproached him with having disturbed the slumbers of the tomb, and to both he was compelled to utter the dreadful words, "I curse thee for ever." The terrible imprecation was constantly passing his lips, yet was he in incessant terror lest he should forget it, or dream of her without being able to repeat it, and then, on awakening, find himself in her arms. Else would he recall her expiring words, and, appalled at their terrific import, imagine that the doom of his perdition was irrecoverably past. Whence should he fly from himself? Or how erase from his brain these images and forms of horror? In the din of combat, in the tumult of war, and its incessant pour of victory to defeat, from the cry of anguish to the exultation of victory, in these he hoped to find at least the relief of distraction, but here, too, he was disappointed. The giant fang of apprehension now seized him, who had never before known fear. Each drop of blood that sprayed upon him seemed the cold blood that had gushed from Brunhilde's wound. Each dying wretch that fell beside him looked like her. When expiring, she exclaimed, "Thou too art doomed to perdition," so that the aspect of death seemed more full of dread to him than aught beside, and this unconquerable terror compelled him to abandon the battlefield. At length, after many a weary and fruitless wandering, he returned to his castle. Here all was deserted and silent, as if the sword or a still more deadly pestilence had laid everything waste. For the few inhabitants that still remained, and even those servants who had once shewn themselves the most attached, now fled from him, as though he had been branded with the mark of Cain. With horror he perceived that, by uniting himself, as he had done with the dead, he had cut himself off from the living, who refused to hold any intercourse with him. Often, when he stood on the battlements of his castle, and looked down upon desolate fields, he compared their present solitude with the lively activity they were wont to exhibit under the strict but benevolent discipline of Swanhilda. He now felt that she alone could reconcile him to life, but durst he hope that one whom he so deeply aggrieved could pardon him and receive him again? Impatience at length got the better of fear. He sought Swanhilda, and, with the deepest contrition, acknowledged his complicated guilt. Embracing her knees, he beseeched her to pardon him, and to return to his desolate castle, in order that it might again become the abode of contentment and peace. The pale form which she beheld at her feet, the shadow of the lately blooming youth, touched Swanhilda. "The folly," said she gently, "though it has caused me such sorrow, has never excited my resentment or my anger. But say, where are my children?" To this dreadful interrogation the agonized father could for a while frame no reply. At length he was obliged to confess the dreadful truth. Then we were sundered forever, returned Swanhilda, nor could all his tears or supplications prevail upon her to revoke the sentence she had given. Stripped of his last earthly hope, bereft of his last consolation, and thereby rendered as poor as mortal can possibly be on this side of the grave, Walter returned homewards, when, as he was riding through the forest in the neighborhood of his castle, absorbed in his gloomy meditations, the sudden sound of a horn roused him from his reverie. Shortly after he saw appear a female figure clad in black and mounted on a steed of the same color. Her attire was like that of a huntress, but instead of a falcon she bore a raven in her hand, and she was attended by a gay troop of cavaliers and dames. The first salutations being past, he found that she was proceeding the same road as himself, and when she found that Walter's castle was close at hand, she requested that he would lodge her for that night, the evening being far advanced. Most willingly did he comply with his request, since the appearance of the beautiful stranger had struck him greatly. So wonderfully did she resemble Swanhilda, except that her locks were brown, and her eye dark and full of fire. With a sumptuous banquet did he entertain his guest, whose mirth and songs enlivened the lately silent halls. 3 days did this revelry continue, and so exhilarating did it prove to Walter that he seemed to have forgotten his sorrows and his fears, nor could he prevail upon himself to dismiss his visitors, dreading lest, on their departure, the castle would seem 100 times more desolate than before, and his grief be proportionately increased. At his earnest request, the stranger consented to stay 7 days, and again another 7 days. Without being requested, she took upon herself the superintendence of the household, which she regulated as discreetly and cheerfully as Swanhilda had been wont to do, so that the castle, which had so lately been the abode of melancholy and horror, became the residence of pleasure and festivity, and Walter's grief disappeared altogether in the midst of so much gaiety. Daily did his attachment to the fair unknown increase. He even made her his confidant, and one evening, as they were walking together apart from any of her train, he related to her his melancholy and frightful history. "My dear friend," returned she, as soon as he had finished his tale, "it ill beseems a man of thy discretion to afflict thyself on account of all this. Thou hast awakened the dead from the sleep of the grave, and afterwards found, what might have been anticipated, that the dead possess no sympathy with life. What then? Thou wilt not commit this error a second time. Thou hast, however, murdered the being whom thou hadst thus recalled again to existence, but it was only in appearance, for thou couldst not deprive that of life which properly had none. Thou hast too lost a wife and 2 children, but at thy years such a loss is most easily repaired. There are beauties who will gladly share thy couch, and make thee again a father. But thou dreadst the reckoning of hereafter. Go upon the graves, and ask the sleepers there whether that hereafter disturbs them." In such manner would she frequently exhort and cheer him, so that, in a short time, his melancholy entirely disappeared. He now ventured to declare to the unknown the passion with which she had inspired him, nor did she refuse him her hand. Within 7 days afterwards the nuptials were celebrated,
and the very foundations of the castle seemed to rock from the wild, tumultuous uproar of unrestrained riot. The wine streamed in abundance, the goblets circled incessantly, intemperance reached its utmost bounds, while shouts of laughter, almost resembling madness, burst from the numerous train belonging to the unknown. At length Walter, heated with wine and love, conducted his bride into the nuptial chamber, but oh, horror! Scarcely had he clasped her in his arms ere she transformed herself into a monstrous serpent, which, entwining him in its horrid folds, crushed him to death. Flames cracked on every side of the apartment. In a few minutes after, the whole castle was enveloped in a blaze that consumed it entirely, while as the walls fell in with a tremendous crash, a voice exclaimed aloud, "Wake not the dead!"